The invisible librarian. Have you ever felt like you were working so hard, giving so much, and yet no one seemed to notice you were even there? Have you ever sat in a room full of people and felt completely alone, as if your presence didn't matter at all? Have you ever wondered if the years you spent being quiet, being patient, being steady, were somehow being wasted, invisible to the world, invisible even to yourself? Have you ever looked at others moving forward, getting recognized, as being celebrated, while you stayed in the same place, doing the same things, and felt that hollow ache of wondering if you would ever be seen? If any of those questions touched something inside you, then this story is for you. Sometimes the universe hides you, not to reject you, but to protect your growth where applause cannot reach. Her name was Margaret Elaine Howell, and most people in the town of Clover Falls didn't really know she existed. Not in the way that matters. They knew her face, the way you know the face of someone you pass in a grocery store. They knew she worked at the library on Birch Street. They knew she wore her grey-brown hair pulled back and that she always had a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. But knowing those things about a person is not the same as knowing them. And Margaret had lived most of her 53 years understanding that difference very well. She had started at the Clover Falls Public Library when she was 26 years old. It wasn't the job she had imagined for herself when she was young. She had studied literature in college, had dreamed of writing, had filled 3 journals with the beginnings of stories she never finished. But life had a way of redirecting people, and Margaret had let herself be redirected without too much resistance. She needed steady work. The library needed someone with care and patience. It had seemed at the time like a reasonable fit. That was 27 years ago. Now she arrived every morning at 8:15, 15 minutes before the library opened. She unlocked the heavy wooden door, stepped into the cool quiet of the building, and stood still for just a moment, letting the silence settle around her like something familiar. Before the children came in, before the regulars arrived, before anyone needed anything. Just her and the books and the pale light coming through the tall windows. She would turn on the lights, one section at a time. She knew the order by heart. Reference first, then fiction, then the children's wing, then periodicals. She would check the returns bin, sort the books, push the cart through the shelves, and slide each one back into its place. She knew where every book belonged, not just by the Dewey Decimal System, though she knew that too. She knew by feel. She knew this library the way you know a house you've lived in for a long time. She had a small office in the back, more of a closet really, with a desk covered in paper and a window that looked out onto the alley. She ate her lunch there most days, a sandwich and an apple. She read during lunch, always. She had read hundreds of books in that small room, sitting alone while the town moved around her outside. The people of Clover Falls were mostly kind to her. But there is a kind of kindness that comes from people who don't really see you, and Margaret had learned to recognize it. They smiled when she helped them. They said thank you. They called her the lady at the library when they mentioned her to others. She had overheard this once at the hardware store. She'd gotten very good at pretending not to hear things. It wasn't that Margaret was unhappy. She was careful with that word. Unhappy was too simple for what she felt, and she had always believed that the wrong word for something was worse than no word at all. She was more like someone standing slightly outside the frame of a photograph, present, but not quite captured. There in the background, maybe, if you looked carefully. But not the subject. Never the subject. The director of the library was a man named Charles Blevins, hired 3 years ago from a larger city system with very definite ideas about modernization and digital engagement metrics. He held staff meetings twice a month about goals and benchmarks. He praised the younger staff for their social media ideas. Margaret sat in those meetings and took notes and said very little. She had tried once to suggest a reading initiative for elderly residents. Charles had listened politely and moved on. She had not suggested anything since. There were 2 other full-time staff members and 2 part-time college students who rotated shifts. They were pleasant enough and liked the younger librarian who ran the children's programs. They were a little uncertain about Margaret. She understood why. She was not easy to know quickly, and young people often wanted things quickly. She didn't go home to a family. She had an apartment on the east side of town, a cat named Barnaby, who greeted her every evening with complete indifference, and a creek path she walked on weekends. She called her sister in Portland once a week. They talked about small things. Neither of them was very good at large things. She was not alone in a way that felt tragic. She had made peace with the shape of her life. But there were evenings when she sat in her chair with Barnaby warm on her lap and felt something she couldn't quite name. A kind of weight. Not sadness exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of a person who has been in the same place for so long that the place has stopped noticing them. She wondered sometimes if any of it mattered. The books she reshelved, would anyone notice if they were slightly wrong? The quiet ways she helped people. Would they remember her if she were gone? She would catch these thoughts and set them aside, the way you set aside a letter you're not ready to read. But they came back, as unread letters do. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was what happened to people after they left her library. There was a boy named Samuel who came in every Tuesday after school. He was 12, wore glasses held together with tape on one side, and always went straight to the science fiction section without stopping at the desk. He had never once spoken to Margaret until the day he couldn't find the next book in a series he was reading and stood in the aisle looking lost. She had noticed him from across the room. She noticed most things in her library and walked over and asked if she could help. She found the book in the back order holds, a returned copy that hadn't been shelved yet. He had looked at her then with the particular gratitude of a child who has been genuinely helped, not just patronized. She didn't know that 6 years later, in his college application essay, he would write about a librarian in his hometown who seemed to know where every book in the world was. He wouldn't remember her name, but he would remember the feeling. There was a woman named Dolores who had moved to Clover Falls after her husband died and who came to the library not really for books, but because she needed somewhere to go. She would sit in the reading room for 2 hours every Thursday. Margaret had noticed she always picked up magazines but never really read them, just turned the pages slowly. One Thursday, Margaret had placed a novel on the table beside her, quietly, without saying anything, a book about a woman starting over after loss that she thought Dolores might find some comfort in. Dolores had looked up, surprised. Margaret had just smiled and gone back to her desk. Dolores read that book 3 times. She later joined a grief support group whose facilitator had recommended a similar book, and that coincidence felt to her like a sign that she was on the right path. She never connected the thread back to the librarian who had placed the first book. These things happened around Margaret constantly, like ripples from a stone that doesn't see its own impact. She gave reading recommendations because she had listened to what people said without them knowing they were being listened to. She ordered books based on what she heard in town: the new parents, the woman taking night classes, the retired carpenter who had started asking about woodworking history. She stayed late twice a month for a quiet reading hour she organized for 3 elderly men who couldn't drive anymore. Charles didn't know about the reading hour. It wasn't in any report. It just happened. She had built something in that library, though she couldn't have named it easily. Not a program or a metric. Something softer and more durable. The particular safety that comes from a place where someone is always paying attention without wanting anything in return. One morning in November, about 2 years after she had begun to feel the heaviest version of that weight in her chest, something small happened that she almost missed entirely. She was shelving books in the biography section when she heard a voice behind her. She turned and found a woman she didn't recognize. Late 30s, a heavy coat, hair still damp from outside. The woman was holding a piece of paper and looking around the room with the expression of someone trying to find their footing in an unfamiliar place. "Excuse me," the woman said. "I'm looking for someone. I was told the head librarian here, I don't know her name. I was told she might be able to help me find some historical records for a research project." Margaret set down the books she was holding. "I'm not the head librarian," she said, "but I may be able to help." The woman's name was Andrea Castillo, and she was a documentary filmmaker from the city, working on a project about small towns in the region and the institutions that held them together. She had been referred to the Clover Falls Library by a professor at the State University, who had told her that the local collection there had some unusual depth in community records that other archives in the area lacked. Margaret had built that collection. Over 27 years, quietly and without announcement, she had worked to preserve every local history document she could find. Old newspapers, town council minutes, photographs donated by families, school records, church bulletins, the diaries of 2 residents who had agreed to donate them. She had catalogued all of it, then digitized as much as she could. She had applied for 3 small grants to fund the digitization, writing the applications herself at home in the evenings. The grants had all been approved. The collection existed because of her alone. She showed Andrea the archive room, a small temperature-controlled space down a narrow hallway at the back of the building, with metal shelving and flat archival boxes lined up with careful labels. Andrea stopped in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment. "Who organized all of this?" she asked. "I did," Margaret said. Andrea looked at her. "Over how long?" "Most of it over the last 15 years. Some of it goes back to when I first started." There was a pause, and then Andrea said something that Margaret would think about for a long time afterward. "Do people here know you did this?" Margaret considered the question honestly. "I don't think most of them have thought about it much," she said. Andrea spent 2 days at the library. She came back the first day with a camera and a recorder and asked if she could document the archive and interview Margaret about the collection. Margaret said yes, though she felt strange about it, the way you feel when someone shines a light on you after years of standing in the peripheral dark. On the second day, while they were reviewing old photographs together, Andrea said something that cracked something open in Margaret's chest quietly and permanently. "You know," Andrea said, looking at a photograph of the town's main street from 1953. "The people in this photo are long gone. Their names, their stories, they only survive because someone like you decided they mattered. You kept them alive. That's not a small thing. That's actually a profound thing." Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked at the photograph for a moment, at the faces of people who had walked these same streets, who had lived their own invisible lives, who were now held in a box in a temperature-controlled room because she had decided they deserved to be kept. She understood something then that she hadn't been able to put into words before. She had spent 27 years preserving the memory of people who would otherwise be forgotten, and she had never once applied that understanding to herself. She had been so busy making sure others were seen that she hadn't considered whether the act of seeing was itself a form of being. She had thought for a long time that to matter, you had to be noticed. But the archive around her told a different story. These photographs didn't know they were being preserved. They existed in their original form, important and complete, long before anyone with a camera showed up to acknowledge them, and she had always been the one with the camera. The documentary was finished the following spring. It aired on a regional public television network and was later made available online. There was a segment, about 8 minutes long, that focused on the archive and on Margaret specifically. It was quiet and unhurried. It felt like the library itself. A few weeks after it aired, things began to happen. An email arrived from a woman in Oregon who had recognized a photograph of her grandmother. Margaret had 3 letters and a land deed related to this family. She scanned them and sent them that same afternoon. A man drove 3 hours from a neighboring state because he realized the town records might include information about his father's family, who had settled in the region in the 1920s. Margaret spent a morning with him in the archive room, pulling boxes and opening folders, watching his expression as he held documents that connected him to people he had never known. At one point, he had to step away and stand by the window for a minute. She understood why. She didn't say anything. A local history group contacted Charles Blevins and asked if the library would host a series of events around the archive collection. Charles said yes enthusiastically, and then came to Margaret's office and asked how soon she could be ready. She looked at him across her paper-covered desk and said, "I've been ready for 27 years. It was the most direct thing she had ever said to him. He blinked, and something shifted in his face. He didn't apologize. She didn't need him to. The work had always existed, regardless of whether he had known about it. The events were well attended. People came who had never been in the library before. Margaret stood at the front of the reference room and spoke about the documents and the lives they contained. She was not naturally a public speaker, and she felt the familiar discomfort of being looked at directly. But she had spent enough years looking carefully at things to be able to describe them well. And when she talked about the people in the archive, the carpenter whose meticulous records ran from 1908 to 1946, the school teacher whose lesson plans read like small love letters to education, the families who had arrived with nothing and built something, her voice steadied and became something real, not performance, something true. Samuel, now 18 and preparing for college, came to one of the events with his mother. He didn't recognize Margaret at first. But when it was over, he approached her and said, "You helped me find a book once, science fiction, 6th grade. I was really upset I couldn't find it, and you just knew where it was." She remembered him. "I'm glad you found it," she said. He nodded, then added with real earnestness, "I'm going to study astrophysics. I've wanted to since I was 12. A pause. I think books had a lot to do with that. She held that sentence carefully after he walked away. On a Tuesday evening in late June, after the library had closed, Margaret sat at her desk and looked out the window at the alley. The sky was still light with that long summer light that makes evenings feel unhurried. She opened her journal, which she hadn't written in for several months, and wrote something that surprised her with its clarity. She wrote, "I thought that growing in the dark meant nothing was growing, but the roots don't need light to go deep. They just need time and the right soil. I have been in the right soil for 27 years, and I didn't know it." She stopped and read it back. It felt true. More than true. It felt like something that had been true for a long time, waiting for her to find the language for it. She thought about all the small things she had done that no one had seen. The late evenings writing grant applications, the reading hours for the men who couldn't drive, the book placed quietly beside Dolores. The archive boxes labeled one by one over 15 years, the recommendation slips tucked into returned books, a small bridge from one story to another. None of it had been loud. None of it had asked to be noticed. It had simply been done steadily, the way rivers move through rock, slowly, invisibly, and permanently. She thought about the people whose lives had brushed against hers, the anxious teenager looking for something to hold on to, the grieving woman who needed somewhere warm to sit, the child who found in a book the first evidence that the universe was large enough to hold everything he dreamed of. She had been present at all of those moments. She had not been seen at them, but she had been there. And being there, she understood now, was its own form of mattering. The noise of the world celebrates the people who are visible, the awards and the recognition and the loud gestures of success. These are real, and she did not dismiss them. But there is another kind of mattering that happens in the quiet, in the unseen years, in the spaces between applause. The kind that builds slowly in the dark, like root systems that will one day hold up something enormous. The kind you carry in you long before the world discovers it. She had been becoming, all this time, while no one was looking. If you are in that quiet place right now, if you are working without recognition, growing without an audience, building something the world has not yet thought to notice, this is what I need you to hear. The seasons where no one sees you are often the seasons where you grow the most. Not in spite of the silence, but because of it. The silence is not evidence of your smallness. It is the condition that allows your deepest work to happen without the distortion that comes from doing things because they will be seen rather than because they matter. There is no wasted year in a life lived with genuine care. Every small act of attention, every quiet moment of service, every choice made in the direction of something real. These accumulate in people and in places, and in the unseen architecture of the world you move through. And one day, in ways you cannot predict, they surface. Quiet perseverance builds the strongest character. The character built in the quiet is more resilient, more honest, more deeply rooted. It has been shaped by the work itself, by the repetition of choosing to care even when caring goes unnoticed, by the discipline of continuing even when continuing seems to change nothing. The hidden years are where the deepest roots grow. Margaret kept working at the Clover Falls Public Library for several more years. She trained new staff, continued building the archive, and started a small oral history project, borrowing a recorder and interviewing long-term residents about their memories of the town. She applied for and received 2 more grants. She was nominated for a state library award. She didn't win. She didn't mind. The nomination had come from Andrea and from one of the men in the reading hour, who had submitted separate letters without knowing about each other. She still ate lunch alone most days. She still walked along the creek on weekends. But the weight she had carried, that hollow ache of the person standing outside the frame, had changed its shape. Not disappeared. Changed. It had become something she could hold differently, less like a verdict and more like a reminder, to look carefully at the people around her who might be feeling what she had felt, who might need a book placed quietly beside them, who might need someone to say out loud that their life mattered. There is something I want you to understand before we finish. Your value is not located in whether the world has found you yet. It is not stored in recognition or applause or the number of people who know your name. Your value lives in what you do when no one is watching. It lives in the care you take, the patience you hold, the small and genuine acts you perform without announcement. It lives in the invisible infrastructure of every life you have touched, even the ones that never looked back to see where the support came from. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not failing because the noise of the world has not yet amplified your name. You are in the season of roots, and the season of roots is not lesser than the season of flowers. Without what happens underground, nothing ever blooms. Some of the most important things that have ever existed were invisible for a long time before they were seen. The archive before the filmmaker arrived, the root before the tree, the current before the light. Keep going, keep caring, keep building in the quiet. Life is preparing you in private, slowly and with tremendous care, before the moment comes when what you have grown in the dark finally rises into the light. And when it does, you will understand something you couldn't have understood before. That every single year of the invisible season was part of it. Every small act was a thread. Every quiet morning, every patient choice, every moment you kept going when no one was watching, all of it was leading somewhere. You were never standing outside the frame. You were always the story.